Khorne, the Lord of Rage. The most important and central concept of the Warhammer 40k universe is, of course, war. It permeates every aspect of every faction in ways that no other franchise can really come close to, and it's been that way for millennia. When you have chaos gods, then, that feed on various emotions and aspects of mortal life, a god that feeds on warfare would certainly be quite potent indeed. That brings us to Khorne, a simple and direct chaos god that relishes all things to do with warfare, violence, and conflict, and has been feeding on these actions since the dawn of humanity. Let's take a brief look at Khorne, his domain in the Warp, and his followers, with plenty of blood along the way. Khorne is the chaos god of rage, violence, hatred, warfare, murder, and bloodshed, and it's this last aspect that is the most important. Khorne's primary concern is the spilling of blood, whether it be combatants or innocents, allies or enemies. It doesn't really matter to him how the blood flows, just that it does. So much so that the common battle cry of his followers is blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. Although some claim that Khorne is a god that respects honor and martial superiority, this has generally been proven false, and these concepts are only utilized by certain Khornate followers to justify their killings. Khorne doesn't care if his followers exhibit any sense of honor in their violence, just as long as they do it, regularly and perpetually. Rage and anger are, of course, important aspects as well, as self-sacrificial bloodshed isn't quite the same as blood spilt on a battlefield, caused by an enraged warrior looking to slaughter everything in their path. Obviously, there have been conflicts born from hatred and rage since the dawn of man, so it's no surprise that Khorne is said to have been the first of the Chaos Gods to manifest. While none of the Chaos Gods get along with one another, Khorne bears a special hatred for Slaanesh, although the reasons for this are not as clear-cut as the differences between Nurgle and Tzeentch. Slaanesh, devoted to pleasure and obsessions, turns combat into an art form, taking pleasure in watching talented combatants fight one another, where the act of spilling blood is secondary to the beauty of the movements and actions involved. Khorne views this as offensive and degenerate, as combat should always be about bloodshed, not pleasure. Khorne, of course, also doesn't care much for Tzeentch and his followers, viewing them as cowardly sorcerers unwilling to engage in direct physical combat. While Tzeentch might potentially be the most powerful of the Chaos Gods due to knowing what the future holds, and Nurgle has the most followers across the galaxy, Khorne is certainly the most potent and active of the four. Every conflict, big or small, and every act of violence feeds Khorne in some way, and with grand battles routinely occurring involving millions upon millions of deaths, his rage and power only continues to grow. He doesn't need to weave any complicated schemes or promise mortals immense power and prestige, as all he needs is for the galaxy to continue as it has for many millennia. That's not to suggest that he's not involved in all of these conflicts, however, as Khorne's presence is felt in all of them, from an angry dispute between two civilians to the orbital bombardment of an entire planet. Khorne fans the flames of discord, anger, and violence, encouraging mortals to slip over the edge into wanton mayhem. An argument that suddenly turns violent might very well be due to Khorne's influence, as this perfectly feeds his thirst for blood, and before long he may just gain a new follower that shares that thirst. Khorne's appearance is generally consistent, appearing as a massive, muscular humanoid standing hundreds of feet tall and coated in heavy, overlapping plates of armor made from brass and blackened iron. His face is that of a twisted, savage, snarling dog, and his every word is a growl of fury. He generally resides on his brass throne, which sits atop a mountain of skulls. The skulls are from both his champions as well as his enemies, consisting of 100,000 different species, from countless human skulls to tyrannid skulls the size of a city block. He also possesses a tremendous two-handed sword, known by a number of names, including Woebringer and the End of All Things, and it's said that when he takes up this sword, a single swing can cut through reality itself, allowing his legions to spill forth. Khorne's skull throne is at the heart of his domain in the Warp, a realm filled with battlefields soaked in blood and covered in demons waging constant battles with one another. This perpetual infighting only pauses if any foolhardy invaders seek to wage a doomed war against the Lord of Blood, before the demons will return to slaughtering one another over and over again for Khorne's amusement. The realm itself is also at war with itself, as storms rage across crimson skies, sending powerful bursts of wind across the plains and mountains, tearing into the land and ripping up great chunks of blood-drenched earth. Earthquakes fight back against the storms by sending great gouts of molten brass into the sky, burning up the storm clouds, and new mountains erupt out of the flat ground to block the storm's advances. The terrain is also interrupted by great rivers of boiling blood crisscrossing across the landscape, dividing it into territories which the demons fight over, and new rivers of blood will pop up spontaneously, splitting the lands in new ways to encourage new warfare. The earth retaliates against this as well, as earthquakes push the rivers closed again, and volcanoes spew molten brass into them to seal them shut. It is a realm of perpetual violence of all aspects, and any visitor to the realm would surely be driven mad, knowing that everything here, from the blood god to the demons to even the rocks and wind, is looking to kill them. To witness the carnage here is to know that conflict is a living, breathing thing. At the edge of Khorne's domain is a ring of volcanoes reaching hundreds of kilometers into the air, belching black smoke and molten brass, creating a border that can't be seen nor navigated through. Anyone attempting to cross into Khorne's realm will be met by toxic ash, scorching brass, blood storms, and jagged rock. Demons of stone and liquid metal also form here, born of rage and defiance, bludgeoning and scorching any would-be invaders with mindless fury and pure violence before falling back into lifeless piles. At the base of the volcanoes are the demon forges, where countless weapons of war of all types are crafted to supply the eternal war, along with the components of the blood god's demon engines. The anvils here contain the enslaved souls of any mortals who would dare attempt to invade Khorne's realm, their tormented screams mingling with the sounds of the forges. The thousands of blood rivers cutting across the realm all dump out at the same location, plunging downward in massive red waterfalls, forming the Lake of Slaughter, larger than any ocean in the mortal realm. Leviathans of brass and bone swim throughout this lake, devouring everything they come across, as demons fly above the lake while doing battle with dragons made of pure solid blood. The lake itself is animate, snatching anything it can out of the sky that comes too close, and its waves take the shape of battling warriors, crashing violently against one another. On the far shore of this lake rests a tremendous field of skulls, so numerous that the ground can never be seen. This field stretches into the distance for kilometers before reaching a great black wall, the outer perimeter of the brass citadel. On top of the walls, inside of them, and above them are loyal demons dedicated to protecting the citadel from any would-be intruders, although it's rare that any force could muster the strength to even approach the citadel, let alone breach its walls. Although the other Chaos Gods could gain much if they managed to defeat Khorne in his citadel, the chance of success is too low, and the risk of rousing Khorne to battle too great to be worth many attempts. One very curious aspect of the Brass Citadel is not demonic in nature at all, but rather is orcish. An orc warlord by the name of Tuska, calling himself the Demon Killer, had once led his warband straight into the Eye of Terror in search of carnage, utilizing a large number of orc weird boys to bypass the Imperial defenses around Cadia. Tuska soon encountered several demon worlds belonging to some of the other Chaos Gods, conquering them easily and proving to be quite unstoppable. This changed when they landed on a planet belonging to a demon prince of Khorne, leading to the slaughter of Tuska and his entire warband. Khorne, however, enjoyed Tuska and his murderous carnage so much that he ensured that the orcs rose again the following day, allowing them to repeat their crusade. They were slaughtered again, and so Khorne continued to bring them back over and over, with the orcs never relenting in their bloodlust. Eventually, Khorne was so impressed that he brought them all into his domain, allowing them to fight his elite generals every day for eternity. All of Khorne's followers share this trait of wanton violence and carnage for carnage's sake, from his mortal followers up to his greatest demonic servants. Khorne's temple is the battlefield, and all one has to do to worship him is kill, maim, and burn every day for as long as they exist. Following Khorne is the easiest path to raw physical power, and it's alluring to anyone across the galaxy that wishes for more strength to crush their enemies and see them driven before them. Khorne ends up influencing many of the primitive worlds across the Imperium, where warring tribes are always looking for a way to best their opponents in straight combat. Sorcery and other trickery are frowned upon, so most of Khorne's mortal followers are little more than mindless berserkers looking to make as much blood flow as possible. That's all that really needs to be done to worship and glorify Khorne, so any day spent not spilling blood is blasphemous, leading many bands of Khorne followers to battle one another in the meantime. Those that manage to gain Khorne's favor will be blessed, gaining physical mutations in the form of increased strength or grotesque alterations, such as horns or talons. Long-term Khornates that continue to do battle in Khorne's name will eventually become little more than mindless beasts, slaughtering everything in their path. Khorne's demonic servants are quite similar, eschewing tactics and strategy in battle for raw ferocity and martial prowess. His primary rank and file demons are called Bloodletters, appearing as red-skinned humanoids with large horns and serpentine tongues. Sporting rippling muscles and razor-sharp claws, they don't even need any weapons to slice through armor and kill anything inside of it, but they also generally carry large warp metal swords called Hellblades, capable of cutting through just about any armor forged by a mortal. Despite being the most common soldiers in Khorne's blood legions, they are amongst the most aggressive entities of the warp, and in battle they'll easily enter a horrific frenzy, cutting down everything before them as they try to outdo one another in savagery. Khorne's mounted troops are Blood Crushers, which are bloodletters riding on the backs of demonic steeds called Juggernauts. Juggernauts are a fusion of flesh and machine, an unstoppable force of brass, iron, fire, and blood. Only the most favored of the bloodletters are allowed the privilege of trying to tame one, and if they manage to mount one and survive its thrashing movements, it will be perhaps the most lethal of all war mounts. Other beasts used by the Blood Legion are flesh hounds, vaguely canine creatures used for hunting across great distances, even across space. Their howls of rage are said to chill the heart and haunt a person's nightmares, driving a target to madness before the hound catches up to them to sink their razor-sharp teeth in. Few can outrun or hide from a fleshhound on the hunt, and a pack of these is certainly a fearsome threat. The strongest and most brutal of the bloodletters will be taken to the Brass Citadel, to a vast arena known as the Skull Pit, in order to separate the best of them from the rest. The energies of the fallen will then be granted to those remaining, swelling them with power and transforming their hellblade into a blade of blood. These demons, now known as Heralds of Khorne, will lead the demonic armies underneath them into battle. The greater demons of Khorne are known as bloodthirsters, and these creatures are truly masters of battle in every sense of the concept. They are the very essence of brutality and savagery, and are renowned as the greatest warriors among demonkind, with only the boldest and most heroic of mortals even standing the slimmest chances of survival against them. Most of them stand nearly 10 meters tall, with the largest being the size of a scout titan, their bodies impossibly muscled. From their backs sprout a pair of gigantic bat-like wings, allowing them to fly across a battlefield, and their faces are similar to that of Khorne himself, bestial and snarly. They generally carry a pair of weapons, a massive demonic battle axe, the blade of which is at least as tall as a space marine, and a long barbed whip capable of delivering death at range to even the most agile of their foes. The axes are capable of cleaving an armored battle tank in two, and rather than just destroying a target's physical body, they will consume their souls as well. Bloodthirsters lead the great legions into battle, but rather than utilizing advanced tactics and strategy, they lead with stunning brutality. Of course, select mortals that prove themselves to the blood god time and time again can be elevated to a select position, becoming demon princes of Khorne. These monstrous mortals are imbued with incredible physical power, and as long as they continue to provide a constant flow of blood for Khorne, they will remain in his favor. Finally, there is Khorne's greatest servant, the demon Primarch Angron. Angron was known for his brutality and savagery even before falling to chaos, but Khorne has empowered him, transforming him into a demonic monster capable of battling dozens and dozens of space marines at once. He stands amongst the greatest threats of chaos known to the galaxy, and even if he is bested, he will always return from the warp unscathed and ready for more war. While the other Chaos Gods may have some interesting philosophies related to their existences, Khorne is rather blunt and simple. Rather than being interested in the specific hows and whys of conflict, Khorne is only interested in the conflict itself, which is in itself an interesting commentary on the universe of 40K. The universe cannot exist without war, and so it must perpetuate, for one reason or another, and that will simply continue to feed Khorne. There are always going to be individuals out there, human or otherwise, with an interest in growing more powerful in order to defeat their enemies, and thus turning to Khorne is a simple yet effective way to obtain that power. Whether or not Khorne is the most interesting of the Chaos Gods is certainly up for debate, but you can't deny the results, as millions of fanatics across the galaxy scream and rage on a battlefield in their thirst for blood for the blood god. Tzeentch, the Lord of Change. All of the gods of chaos feed on the emotions and desires of the massive amounts of mortals across the 40K universe. Khorne feeds on warfare, rage, and violence. Nurgle feeds on despair and decay, and Slaanesh on pleasure and excess. While all of those are very clear and observable concepts, often preventable by many if they focus themselves, Tzeentch feeds on something far more subtle and insidious. Although Tzeentch is generally regarded as the lord of magic and sorcery, his nature allows him to corrupt many of the most powerful individuals within the Imperium through a desire for change. Let's take a brief look at Tzeentch, how he operates, and his realm and armies within the Immaterium. Not as blunt as Khorne or as ubiquitous as Nurgle, Tzeentch is a force of chaos that operates in the shadows and behind the veil, twisting and weaving the webs of fate across the universe. Tzeentch is the god of ambition, evolution, intrigue, knowledge, sorcery, lies, and above all, change. While Tzeentch of course preys on highly ambitious mortals that seek power and prestige over their brethren, becoming corrupted by the promise of greatness, Tzeentch's true maliciousness is far more subtle. The desire for change and a better existence is commonplace across most sapient creatures, and this fact is exacerbated by the hellish lives that many suffer through in the 40K universe. Serving the God Emperor of mankind with all your body and soul is well and good when your life is going decently, but faith and loyalty are a lot trickier when they're tested. The subtle machinations of Tzeentch begin to work on those that desire a change in their lives, whispering into their ear that life could be better. From the lowliest of hivers to planetary governors to the Primarchs themselves, anyone potentially willing to better themselves at the cost of others is a target. In many ways, Tzeentch is the most dangerous of the four Chaos Gods, as he is able to perceive the future and can see all possible fates. His overarching plans, however, are impossible to discern, known and understandable only by him. A victory by Tzeentch's forces against mortals is certainly part of his plan, but a defeat could just as easily be part of the plan as well, as he knew that it would happen beforehand and let it happen regardless. His schemes and conspiracies are impossibly complex, entangling entire fleets and battalions into intricate plans just as easily as he alters the fate of a single individual. The only single concept that carries on through all of this is that of change and evolution. Stagnancy and acceptance is anathema to Tzeentch, and so therefore Nurgle is his opposite, being a god of accepting one's situation and relishing in it. Legend has it that at one point, Tzeentch's knowledge and power were so formidable that he ruled supreme over the warp, his powers dwarfing the other Chaos Gods. This changed, however, when the others temporarily set aside their differences, joining together to battle Tzeentch. Knowing that he would be destroyed otherwise, he cast a great spell upon himself, crystallizing his thoughts and body as he was shattered into 10,000 pieces. These shards were flung across space and time, forever weakening him, while legend states that this marked the beginning of the use of sorcery in real space. The powers of sorcery are the clearest way that Tzeentch empowers mortals, granting them access to incredible psychic abilities. Sorcerers of chaos wield death, destruction, and mutation, and while there are some sorcerers in service to Nurgle and Slaanesh, as well as those of Chaos Undivided, the most potent sorcerers of chaos all serve Tzeentch. Psykers are, of course, most likely to be drawn in by Tzeentch then, as their minds are already open to the warp, and the promise of more psychic power can often be incredibly alluring to those that have already tasted it. The most notable example of this is, of course, the Primarch, Magnus the Red, who too readily delved into the Immaterium and quickly accepted Tzeentch's assistance when presented with a problem that he couldn't solve. This desire for power or knowledge is what draws Tzeentch in, from Magnus the Red wanting to breach the webway to get a message to Terra, to a scholar desperately searching for the answer to a problem that they just can't solve. From the desperate admiral to the starving commoner, who both could be convinced with a little push that perhaps there's an easier way to improve their situation. All of this fits into Tzeentch's grand plan, whatever that may be, and while some say that Tzeentch hopes to use all of these schemes and plots to regain his supreme power and position as the dominant force of chaos in the universe, others suggest that he'd rather not be the victor at all. To win the great game would mean an end to all the plots and schemes, a fate that surely Tzeentch would wish to avoid. So perhaps then, Tzeentch's master plan is only to forever perpetuate the master plan, a paradoxical existence that only makes sense to a Lord of Chaos. Physically, Tzeentch manifests in a variety of forms, almost always surrounded by a veil of visible magic, forms of people and places swirling amidst it. He commonly appears as a thin, lanky sorcerer, either male or female, in robes that continually change color. His head will hang low, his arms will appear long and spindly, and atop his head will be two sweeping horns crackling with arcane fire. Sometimes his skin will be covered in faces and mouths, shifting and sliding across his surface as they whisper dark and terrible secrets. Other times, Tzeentch will appear only as a cloud of multicolored smoke, or a swirling mass of faces in mist, or a writhing mass of fleshy protoplasm. Others have claimed to see him as mutated animals or perverse hybridized versions, with both birds and fish appearing heavily in Tzeentch's iconography and in the shapes taken by many of his followers. Some claim that he'll appear as all of these forms at once, an impossibility made possible through the power of chaos, or that no one can truly view Tzeentch's physical form, and all of these observations are merely the best that a mortal mind can comprehend. Tzeentch's realm within the Immaterium is said to be as fluid and shifting as he himself is, constantly in flux based on Tzeentch's whims, desires, and moods. Most who visit the domain will quickly succumb to madness, and it takes an exceptionally strong mind and will to interpret even one facet of the realm coherently. The most common description of the realm is that of a massive crystalline labyrinth resting upon an immense iridescent plateau, consisting of ever-shifting crystal avenues glittering in every color. There are no demonic warriors guarding the passageways, however, but rather only those of the strongest of minds can navigate the mystifying labyrinth, its gleaming corridors reflecting not only light, but also dreams, hope, misery, and nightmares. All of this will quickly drive most to despair and madness as they attempt to discern an order to the maze that constantly changes. It doesn't take much for a visitor to become caught in a dead end thanks to a shifting wall, trapped in the labyrinth for all eternity. There is said to be one true path through the labyrinth, with the claim that if navigated correctly, it will lead to infinite knowledge. This path is connected by 9 golden gateways, with 9 being a sacred number to Tzeentch, and it's protected by an entity known as the Guardian of the Maze, appearing as little more than a giant, gloating mouth. When someone approaches one of the gateways, the Guardian will ask them a question, one of the 999 riddles of Zarazoth. These riddles are said to be so taxing that only the greatest lateral and logical thinkers can discern their answer, and if answered incorrectly, the Guardian will swallow the intruder whole. Legend has it that only one individual has ever managed to make it through all 9 gateways, someone clad in the guise of a young girl along with a small black dog. When Tzeentch questioned the Guardian about this failure, the Guardian claimed that the girl cheated. At the center of the crystalline labyrinth, if such a place could truly have a center, is the impossible fortress, a perplexing edifice of imbalanced spires and swirling warp fire. The architecture of the fortress is even more maddening than the labyrinth, and even amongst Tzeentch's servants, only a select few can successfully navigate its corridors. Deep inside the fortress is said to lie Tzeentch's hidden library, containing an infinite collection of tomes and scrolls. Across these documents is every scrap of knowledge and thought since creation, of stories both written and unwritten, and accounts of futures both potential and actual. Many of these volumes are so weighty with knowledge that they gain a sentience of a kind, and argue with one another, rewriting and reorganizing themselves unless bound by magic. Demonic servants work tirelessly here to reshelve the books, catalog the collection, and maintain a distant concept of order. All of these aspects of Tzeentch's realm could be true, or none of them could be, as the Lord of Change only lets visitors perceive what he wishes them to perceive. Speaking of Tzeentch's servants, he, like all of the Chaos Gods, commands hordes of demons and mortal servants to assist in carrying out his plots. While Tzeentch typically furthers his goals with subtle machinations and sorcery, there are of course times where a degree of force is necessary, and that's where the scintillating legions come in. These armies are as fluctuating and fluid as Tzeentch himself, manifesting with kaleidoscopic bursts of magical energy and swarming over their opponents while raining down great blasts of warp fire. Each scintillating legion is commanded by one of Tzeentch's greater demons, known as a Lord of Change, and each legion is further divided into 9 smaller hosts, each of which are directed in battle by demon princes and heralds of Tzeentch. The leaders of the hosts all compete with one another in endless schemes within schemes to curry favor with Tzeentch, who delights in and encourages the practice. The most common and basic entity within the legions is known as a horror, a scampering, frantic mass of pink flesh that swarms over enemies as they unleash raw warp energy directly out of their bodies. Horrors are quite literally magic made into physical form, and while their claws and fangs are quite deadly enough, it's the release of their own energy that is their most damaging aspect. This energy burns, but also changes, causing targets to become statues of screaming glass, or clouds of butterflies, or mounds of tentacled flesh. The horrors carry out this task gleefully, laughing maniacally and cartwheeling across the battlefield, leading any battle featuring Tzeentch's hordes to be a maddening display of sounds and colors. When a pink horror is killed by being blown up or cut into pieces, it will proceed to reform into 2 smaller blue demons. These blue horrors lack the jubilance of the original, instead whining morosely about their fate, but they will take out their misery on whomever killed them in the first place. If killed again, the blue horrors will split and reform further into tiny brimstone horrors of pure spite that seek to burn their enemies to ash. Another lesser demon of Tzeentch is the Screamer, a large flying creature that soars through the skies and emits a piercing shriek, which is said to have a profoundly disconcerting psychological effect on those who hear it. Screamers are capable of magical attacks, such as emitting arcs of warp lightning, but their real threat is in their speed and their jaws. Few things can outrun a pack of screamers, including starships, and their jaws are so powerful that they're capable of biting directly through a void ship's hull. While a Gellerfield will often protect the ship from demonic entities, screamers will continue to follow a ship through the warp, systematically testing the field for weaknesses. If they manage to find one, they can quickly breach the ship, allowing raw chaos energy to flood the interior as they set about devouring the inhabitants. Flamers are another deadly lesser demon in Tzeentch's control, a disturbing creature consisting of a lanky body with a number of fanged mouths on its top, bottom, and at the ends of its two long arms. They move by hopping around, which may seem humorous until their mouths begin to belch out great gouts of magical warp fire. This fire is highly unpredictable, mutating victims caught in it in the blink of an eye, and is capable of an endless amount of effects. The fires might turn flesh into ice, or metal into wood, or it might burn away only flesh and leave the armor behind, or it might just do the opposite. It might sear a target's soul rather than their body, or it might even regenerate a victim's wounds rather than hurting them. Much like the pink horrors, flamers are truly a chaotic presence on a battlefield, while also being quite deadly most of the time. The greatest of the pink horrors, if one manages to win the favor of Tzeentch, will be elevated to the position of Herald, and will be given command of one of the hosts. Rather than mindlessly frolicking across the battlefield, heralds are intelligent and devious, empowered in their magical abilities, and capable of mutating nearby demons into stronger forms. Some of the heralds wield incredibly potent mutating magics and lead packs of horrors directly. Others swoop and dive across the battlefield in a burning chariot of Tzeentch, and others fly on discs of Tzeentch at great speed, unleashing psychic powers from a distance while handily avoiding any counterattacks. As for the greater demons of Tzeentch, the most elevated of the demonic entities are the Lords of Change, being incredibly intelligent and wielding potent sorcery. These typically take the form of a large bird-like creature with lengthy necks and multicolored wings. The Lords of Change take after their master in many ways, principally their talent and predilection for schemes, plots, and deceit. Each of them weaves countless intricate plans and schemes, always staying one step ahead of their opponents. It's very rare for anyone to ever outthink or surprise a Lord of Change, and most of the time, victims of a Lord of Change's plots will be completely unaware that they're even in one until it's too late. Unlike Tzeentch, however, they do not possess a complete picture of the universe, and they can be bested. If this happens, though, the Lords of Change are still amongst the greatest sorcerers in the entire galaxy, wielding warp energy on a scale that few could compete with. The greatest of the Lords of Change is known as Kairos Fateweaver, said to be the Oracle of Tzeentch, and granted Tzeentch's access to all knowledge of past and future. Kairos cannot see what will occur in the present, however, but he's still an incredibly fearsome and intelligent foe. The other most notable servants of Tzeentch are the Demon Princes, a mortal that has been elevated to the highest ranks of his legions. Like all Demon Princes, little remains of their former mortal self once they've been fully transformed, but they gain power that few could ever dream of. At the top of this list, being perhaps the second most powerful Psyker alive aside from the God Emperor, is the Demon Primarch Magnus the Red. Magnus's mere presence warps the fabric of reality and sears the minds of any who observe him. Through his single eye, he sees through both the immaterium and real space, and is capable of launching raw psychic energy potent enough to tear entire titans from reality. As mentioned, Tzeentch is a rather paradoxical entity, as a god that knows everything that will happen, and yet still manages to suffer defeats on occasion. Of course, mortal minds aren't meant to understand such an entity, and if indeed Tzeentch's only goal is to perpetuate his goals, then everything that occurs is simply all a part of the plan. Tzeentch is an interesting aspect of the 40k universe, as he feeds on ambition and the will of mortals that wish to change their situation. While we typically associate these things with corruption, such as a greedy planetary governor that wants more and more for himself at the cost of others, Tzeentch truly thrives in much more unfortunate situations, where people only wish to accomplish the greater good. Making a small deal with dark forces is a pretty bad thing, but if it could lead to saving some lives or helping some people in need, surely that can't be too bad. This is made even worse by how subtle and insidious Tzeentch and his servants can be, not appearing as shady-looking demons, but rather as ordinary individuals that might just be able to pass on a little help, if the person is interested. As they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and while very few people in the 40k universe are willing to openly accept demonic help, the idea of wanting to change their lives for the better in some way is likely very common indeed. Catan, the gods of real space. The lore of Warhammer 40k goes back millions and millions of years, long before the present squabbles of humans, orcs, Eldar, and chaos. It's often surprising to some that as highly advanced as, say, the Imperium of Mankind is, with their giant ships and virus bombs and walking titans, their technology and power doesn't hold a candle to some civilizations from millions of years prior. The Necrons, the walking metallic undead that have been slowly awakening in the present day, were once the most powerful civilization to ever exist, but they didn't become so without a little assistance. That assistance came in the form of the Catan, enigmatic entities that predate pretty much every other form of life in existence, and continue to exist in the present day. I've already discussed them briefly in my video covering the Necrons, but let's dive into a little more detail about these reality-bending gods. Seen as how they're said to be the first entities created, at the beginning of the universe, we don't exactly have any historical records in-universe detailing their creation. It's said that they were formed at the same moment as creation itself, forming from the vast energies unleashed in that moment. At this time, long before the first planets came into shape, the Catan emerged from the roiling seas of plasma and solar flares, bearing little resemblance to their later forms. Here they were simply monstrous parasites that took to suckling on the solar energies of various stars, shortening the star's lifespan by millions of years. They proceeded to use the universe's electromagnetic flux to drift across the cosmos to feed on as many stars as they could. They were entities of pure energy, and only the vast power of a star could nourish them, so they ignored the relatively barren planets they drifted by. During this untold time, as these star vampires continued to drift and feed, a race of sapient creatures began to expand across the universe, utilizing both advanced technologies and potent psychic powers, known today only as the Old Ones. According to one Catan, known as the Deceiver, the Old Ones went to war with the star vampires, and won, forcing them into hiding for a great many years. We have no way of knowing if this is true, and an entity known as the Deceiver is not the most reliable source, but what we do know is that the Catan were eventually discovered by the Necrontyr. The Necrontyr were an unfortunate race of humanoids that originated on a barren and radiation-blasted world. They lived short, bleak lives here, their cities little more than massive tombs, and eventually realized that science would never allow them to live comfortably on this planet. Instead, they took to the stars, utilizing slow-moving ships equipped with stasis crypts. Before long, they met the Old Ones and saw how hopeful and powerful the Old Ones were. They petitioned them for their secret of long life, but the Old Ones refused to share any knowledge. This ignited a fire in the hearts of the Necrontyr, who dedicated their lives to destroying the Old Ones. This was a rather questionable decision, however, as the Old Ones outclassed the Necrontyr in practically every way, including their way of traveling vast distances due to a system known as the Webway, and their psychic abilities. To no one's surprise, the Old Ones easily beat the Necrontyr back into the far reaches of space, where they were considered to be little more than a minor annoyance. Here they sat, in a form of impotent imprisonment, for centuries, desperately attempting to find a suitable weapon to use to strike back against the Old Ones. During this time, the surviving Necrontyr fell into a war of succession, with the various dynasties vying for control. The leader of the Necrontyr, Zarek the Silent King, began to perceive some anomalies in the oldest dying stars, leading to an extremely curious discovery. There were entities living on these stars, creatures of pure energy feeding on solar flares and magnetic storms. These creatures were perceived by the Necrontyr as the children of their death god, and believed that they would be the weapons they needed to strike down the Old Ones. As such, they named these entities Catan, meaning star gods. How exactly the Necrontyr managed to make contact with such vast and alien entities of energy is unknown, but for them to be used as weapons, they needed physical bodies of some sort. The Necrontyr had access to a material called necrodermis, or living metal, which in layman's terms would be akin to nanomachines. They had used this material to make their starships, but now it could be used to provide a physical body for the Catan to inhabit. This was a new mode of existence for the Catan, and they came to understand the realities of corporeal life, and appreciate the pleasures that could be available to creatures of matter. The first Catan to enter a physical form, Azagorod the Nightbringer, realized that the life forces of mortals tasted far better than that of the stars they had been feeding on for millennia. The Nightbringer began feeding on the Necrontyr, gorging itself on their terror and suffering, and it only ceased once the Necrontyr pledged their servitude and convinced it that there were species without number across the galaxy. Soon the Nightbringer gave physical form to other Catan, who each began craving worshippers and slaves, spreading insanity and death across the cosmos. They were akin to gods operating in real space, the antithesis of the chaos gods of the warp. Thanks to the vast capabilities and knowledge of the Catan, the Necrontyr were poised to relaunch their war against the Old Ones, but one of the Catan still had a plan for the Necrontyr. One of the Catan, named Mephitran, was the most insidious and deceptive among them, who enjoyed using trickery and lies to achieve its goals. Even among the Catan, it was distrusted and shunned, earning it the name of the Deceiver. It was the Deceiver that came to the Necrontyr and told them that there was a way to extend their lives and achieve immortality by shedding their mortal flesh and transferring their minds into metal bodies. The Triarch, the ruling body of the Necrontyr, debated for months on the decision, until finally agreeing to the process of biotransference. Massive bio-furnaces were set up to destroy the Necrontyr's weak bodies and encase their minds in living metal, but they were of course deceived, as the Catan gathered around these furnaces and consumed their life force in the process. The Catan grew even stronger, and the Necrontyr were no more, instead becoming the Necrons, everlasting servants devoid of free will, set to conquer the galaxy in order to continue feeding their masters. With the power of both the Catan and the Necrons combined, the Old Ones stood little chance. The Catan could bend reality to their will, and during their conquests, planets were razed, suns were extinguished, and entire systems were devoured by black holes. Thanks to one of the Catan, the Necrons were able to gain access to the Old One's webway, giving them the ability to swiftly travel the cosmos and accelerate the war against the Old Ones. Unfortunately for the Catan, however, they were not immune to the same squabbles that plagued all sapient races, although the exact reason for the cause of their civil war is unknown. In one version, one of the Eldar gods, the Laughing God, tricked one of the Catan into eating another Catan, driving it insane. In another version, the Deceiver managed to convince the other Catan that of all the life forces that they could consume, the Catan themselves were the greatest, causing a civil war to break out amongst them as the strong fed on the weak. Together, the Catan and the Necrons were the greatest force the galaxy had ever seen, but nothing lasts forever. With their infighting, the Catan were weakened, and a number of races that the Old Ones had created and fostered had begun to rise up in strength and numbers, notably the Eldari. Due to these races sharing the Old Ones' affinity for the warp, they were able to battle against the cold science of the Necrons, pushing them and the Catan back across space. Facing down a potential defeat, the Catan rallied together once more and managed to seal off the warp from sectors of material space, weakening their opponents that depended on the warp for their power. Before long, the Catan and the Necrons had managed to annihilate the Old Ones completely, and they were poised to become the dominant empire of the galaxy. In this moment of victory, however, the Silent King of the Necrons, Sarek, chose to take the opportunity to turn against their masters. Sarek had been imbued during the biotransference with the capability of controlling the entire Necron race, and so he turned their weapons against the Catan in a great revolt. As powerful as the Catan were, they were few, and eventually the might of the Necrons overwhelmed them. That's not to suggest that this revolt was a simple matter, as the devastation was great, and the weapons the Necrons used against them were so terrible that the Silent King ordered them destroyed afterwards, and it's said that they damaged causality itself in the process. Afterwards, the exhaustion of winning 2 wars and the prospects of fighting a third against the Eldar caused the Necrons to go into a great hibernation. Most of the Catan were simply shattered into a number of shards, but some, such as Landagor, were completely annihilated. In Landagor's case, this annihilation prompted it to afflict the Necrons with a virus that causes some of them to go insane with bloodlust, becoming known as Flayed Ones. As for the shattered Catan, they became fragmented into a number of shards, each one an echo of their former self. The Necrons managed to take these shards and contain them in small artifacts called Tesseract Labyrinths. No individual shard has a full recollection of the complete entity it once was, although this doesn't exactly prevent it from harnessing the same power that the Catan displayed. Even as a shard, these entities, if unleashed, can devastate an entire battlefield with little effort. The Necrons in the present day utilize these shards on occasion if the situation calls for it, but they are wary to do so, as it's certainly possible for a shard to break from enslavement. Lost shards of the Catan have been spotted in a number of different places across the galaxy, often attempting to gather up what power they can and enslaving what people they can. Sometimes, in dire situations, the Necrons will unleash an amalgamation of a number of shards gathered together, in a form known as a transcendent Catan, although the chance of collateral damage from such an entity is nearly guaranteed. Let's go over some of the known Catan and their present status. Azagorod the Nightbringer delights in death, suffering, and despair, and it's no surprise that it became known to the Necrontyr as a god of death. The Eldar called it the Destroyer of Light, well, humanity called it the Reaper, and it nourished itself on the fear it caused across the galaxy. Azagorod was the first to appear to the Necrontyr, and in some legends was also the first to be tricked or convinced into consuming the other Catan. It was shattered by the Necron's god-killing hypercannons, and its shards were enslaved. Iash Udra was thought by the Silent King to be the most reviled, and was called the Endless Swarm. It was said to be an everlasting sickness that was birthed in the minds of mortals, continuously being behind and seen through the eyes of all. Apparently, the sorrow of the void brought it to the mortal brink and severed its bonds, upon which point 1,000 tides of misery were released upon the stars. One of its shards is possessed by Trazyn the Infinite, a Necron overlord and keeper of history. As mentioned, Landugor, the Flayed One, was obliterated by the Necrons apparently on the Silent King's orders, and as such there are no shards remaining. Magladroth, the Void Dragon, was said to be the greatest and most terrible of all the Catan. Magladroth was a figure of wanton destruction and devastation, but was also responsible for creating the warp suppression pylons spread across the galaxy to block the Old One's source of psychic power, some of which were located on Cadia. Magladroth was also shattered during the Necron's revolt, its shards imprisoned, although a number of shards escaped. One loose shard managed to lay waste to an entire dynasty of Necrons that went to retrieve it, and it gorged itself on a dozen worlds before being imprisoned. According to some legends, the Void Dragon is the same entity as the Dragon of Mars, an ancient, powerful creature that was defeated by the Emperor of Mankind at some point in the past, and imprisoned in a labyrinth underneath the surface of Mars. There are some similarities between the two, such as the Dragon of Mars being said to have once lived in space between the stars. It had brought entire civilizations into existence and then snuffed them out on a whim, and it waged war with its own kind. Without knowing more about the Dragon of Mars, however, it's impossible to say if it's the same entity as Magladroth. Mephetran, the Deceiver, was the one responsible for convincing the Necrontyr to throw off their mortal forms, and was one of the physically weakest Catan, only surviving due to its deception and cowardice. During the Necron revolt, the Deceiver was quickly shattered, and a number of its shards were imprisoned by the Necrons. Despite this, however, there have been a fair number of shards discovered elsewhere, and each one has been capable of disguising itself in various forms and allowing it to continue wreaking havoc through deception. One shard appeared as a planetary governor, another as a Necron overlord named Nephreth, and another as the Primarch Omegon. It seems likely that the Deceiver is going to continue to be a thorn in just about everyone's sides. Nyadrazatha, the Burning One, was the Catan responsible for revealing to the Necrons on how to access the Old One's webway, thanks to living stone portals known as Dolmen Gates. It was known as an entity that took glee in burning any and all things, and it wished to bring its eldritch fire into the webway. During the Necron revolt, it's said that the Silent King Zarek himself shattered Nyadrazatha with his spear, and one of its shards now powers the Silent King's personal vehicle. Another of its shards was eventually found and claimed by Trazyn the Infinite. Saranoga, the Outsider, is one of the more enigmatic of the Catan, being fairly insane from the onset. Its gaze caused madness and despair, and those in its presence would often rather take their own lives than endure more of it. According to some Eldar legends, the Outsider was the one that was tricked by the Laughing God into devouring its brethren, and this is what truly drove it insane. Regardless, its ultimate fate is fairly unclear, but it doesn't seem to be the case that the Necrons shattered it. instead stating that its madness had become too terrible of a foe to slay. Some claim that it rent itself asunder, while the more common thought is that it went into hiding until it will someday emerge and spread its madness once more. Igrania, the World Shaper, was responsible, as its name implies, for forming a number of artificial worlds belonging to the Necrons. Principal among these was a world named Borsis, also called the World Engine. After Igrania was shattered, one of its great shards was placed inside of Borsis, and in the 41st millennium, a Necron dynasty activated the world and sent it on a path straight to Mars to activate the dragon. The Shard, however, didn't want to go through with this plan, and instead managed to contact a Space Marine chapter. In the end, it made a deal to destroy Borsis if the Imperium would let it go and leave the galaxy, which it appeared to do so. Necron forces are in possession of other shards of Igrania and have used them in battle against the Imperium. Zarhulash, the Potentate, was another that was shattered and enslaved by the Necrons, and was used to power a Necron Pharos, a piece of technology that allowed a user to find, communicate, and even teleport to a location through quantum entanglement rather than the warp. The Archmagos Belisarius Call studied this Pharos and communicated with Zarhulash, who told him that the Catan were the only true gods of the galaxy, and the Necrons were treacherous children who the Catan will someday take revenge against. Call managed to trick Zarhulash into helping him, at which point he teleported Zarhulash to the far end of the galaxy, surrounded by Necron tomb worlds. There are a number of other Catan that have been shattered into shards, which are either contained by the Necrons or are otherwise scattered across the cosmos. There's almost certainly a number more Catan that are unknown, either still intact or perhaps having never been contained in the material realm by the Necrontyr in the first place. It's clear that the Catan are not a benevolent force, but they have since become a devastating part of the Necrons' war force as shackled weapons. If they can continue to gather more and more of these shards and keep them contained for their own purposes, the Necrons could become a truly unbeatable force. On the other hand, if certain scattered Catan can manage to grow in power and rebuild themselves, it's not out of the question that they could become a dominant force in their own right, re-enslaving a number of lesser species. As it stands, though, the Catan serve two purposes within the larger context of Warhammer 40k. They are an interesting aspect of Necron armies that give them access to reality-bending powers, and they appear in all sorts of far-flung places, generally as a shard, capable of instigating all sorts of havoc for pretty much every other faction in the universe. It took everything that the Necrons had, being arguably the most powerful civilization to ever exist, to take down the Catan before, so it's hard to say what would happen if the Catan returned to power. There are a lot of powerful factions and entities in the 40k universe, but being considered the gods of real space certainly commands some respect. Robute Guilliman, the Avenging Sun. Of the 20 genetically engineered sons of the Emperor of Mankind, there are a couple that stand out from the rest as far as the attention they're given. One of these is Horus, the namesake of arguably the most important event in the Imperium's history, and now regarded as their most infamous traitor. The other is Robute Guilliman, a favored son that became known in many ways as Horus's antithesis, a champion of the common people known for his dedication to order, honor, and prosperity. Robute's ability for statesmanship, military doctrine, and organization quickly earned him a unique position in the Imperium, and in the present day has put him second only to the Emperor in leading his people. In this video, we'll go over a summary of Robute's life history, from his early beginnings of leadership up to the massive burdens he currently faces. Sometime in the 30th millennium, the Emperor of Mankind set out to create a number of genetically modified generals, known as Primarchs, each imbued with an aspect of the Emperor himself. This Primarch project would largely be a success, insofar as successfully creating 21 super soldiers, second only in capabilities to the Emperor. Unfortunately, through either the machinations of the Emperor, chaos, or a third party, the Primarchs were all spread across the galaxy. During the Emperor's Great Crusade, to reunite the scattered colonies of humankind, he would also spend the time searching for his lost sons. The child that would become Robute Guilliman ended up on the bleak world of Macragge, a planet that had managed to do fairly well during humanity's age of strife. Its industries were relatively intact, and its people maintained a cohesive society, with the primary form of government consisting of a pair of officials known as consuls. Additionally, they had preserved a number of short-range, warp-capable spacecraft, allowing them to maintain contact with several neighboring systems. The child Primarch's gestation capsule landed in a forest, where he was discovered by a group of hunting noblemen. It's said that the child was strikingly beautiful and surrounded by a glowing nimbus of power. The child, clearly special, was taken to one of the two ruling consuls, Connor Guilliman, who promptly adopted him as his son, naming him Robute, meaning Great One. Connor was a man of great energy and charisma, a notable military leader, and a champion of the common people, not especially beloved by most of the planet's nobility. Robute quickly grew in both body and mind, a prodigy in all things, and by age 10 he had mastered every subject the wisest men of Macragge could teach him. His insights into matters of history, philosophy, and science amazed his teachers, and his ability to make accurate conclusions from small bits of information was said to border on the inexplicable. He was quite attached to Connor, at one point later stating that, while the Emperor may have created him, King Connor of Macragge was his father. Robute's greatest talents, of course, were as a military leader, which led his father to give him command over an expeditionary force, with the task of pacifying the far far northern lands of Macragge named Illyrium. This was a barbarous land of outcasts and petty wars that had managed to successfully resist every previous military campaign. Rather than engaging in a protracted war in the mountains, Roboute simply occupied the Illyrians' sacred shrines. This caused them to surge forth and meet his armies, but rather than crushing them, Roboute instead challenged their chieftain to battle. During the duel, Roboute exhausted the chieftain by merely continuing to dodge his attacks, and afterwards presented to them their most sacred religious artifact, which had been stolen centuries ago by the consuls. This act of diplomacy and humanity convinced the chieftain to halt his campaign, giving Roboute a peaceful victory. On his return to the capital, however, he found the city in chaos, as Conor's co-consul, Galen, had attempted a coup. Conor's policies of supporting the common people rather than the nobility had allowed Galen to gather up a number of noble supporters, and they proceeded to sack their own city. Roboute left his men to restore order to the city, while he rushed to the consul house, finding his father close to death. He had been mortally wounded by an assassin, and hung on just long enough to die in Roboute's arms. Roboute was 12 years old when this occurred, but greater than any man, and he proceeded to lash out in an animal rage on the rioters, swiftly crushing the rebellion. Afterwards, he assumed the title of sole consul of Macragge, and one of his first acts was having Galen and his co-conspirators executed, with their lands and wealth redistributed to the people. Roboute proceeded to completely reorganize Macragg's entire social structure into a meritocracy, where office and honors were given to the hard-working rather than the wealthy and influential. Macragge continued to prosper as it never had before under Roboute's unifying leadership for about 5 years, until the Emperor of Mankind finally arrived. By the time the Emperor arrived, Macragge had transformed from its former self, now a world of uniformity and order, with cities of glittering marble and shining steel, and possessing an army of well-equipped and well-trained soldiers prepared for operations on other worlds. Roboute had spent time dwelling on the ancient histories of his planet, which claimed that Macragge was once part of hundreds of collected worlds in this region, a domain beyond the Seas of Night, called Ultramar. Roboute sought to rebuild this domain of Ultramar, and thus began sending out troops and supply ships to re-establish communication and order. When the Emperor saw what Roboute was doing, he was pleased, and met with him directly rather than in disguise like he had with some of the other Primarchs. Roboute immediately swore fealty to the Emperor, recognizing him as his creator, and he joined the Emperor's Great Crusade. Roboute was given control of the Emperor's 13th Legion of Space Marines, and his oratory and vision upon meeting with them filled them with such renewed vigor and hope that they accepted Roboute as their new leader without question. Roboute, however, set about to transform his legion, as they would not just be a weapon of war, but rather a self-sustaining power for conquest, order, and expansion, the manifest will of the Emperor. In Roboute's mind, it was pointless to simply spread across the galaxy and reconquer the lost colonies if they merely fell back into anarchy after the Crusade moved on. Each world retaken by Roboute's legion, dubbed the Ultramarines, wouldn't be left until it was fully self-sufficient in all aspects. This included defenses, industry, economy, and of course, governance, with an emphasis always being on the well-being of the common people. In the meantime, Roboute's dedication and aptitude for efficiency and public affairs led to the continued prosperity of Macragge and the surrounding systems. This domain, called Ultramar, soon consisted of 500 individual planets, and his prosperity and population was key in providing new recruits and supplies for the Ultramarines. In fact, the Ultramarines soon became the most populated legion, and at one point, over half of all Space Marines in the galaxy were Ultramarines. During the Crusade, Robute's relationships with his brother Primarchs were relatively positive. He considered 4 of them to be among the greatest: Rogel Dorn, Sanguinius, Leman Russ, and Ferrus Manus, calling them the Dauntless Few. His relationships with most of the rest were fairly amicable, although relations between him and Lorgar quickly plummeted after the events at Monarchia. Lorgar and his legion had taken to worshipping the Emperor as a deity, something he heavily frowned upon. Due to this, the Emperor ordered Robute and the Ultramarines to travel to the planet of Kur and lay waste to the capital city of Monarchia, where Lorgar had spread his teachings. After the city was turned into nothing but ash, the Emperor publicly shamed Lorgar and his legion, with Robute and the Ultramarines present. Although Robute appeared to be firmly supportive of the Emperor in carrying out these actions, in truth he was uncomfortable with the Emperor's decision, and upset that he had used him and his legion as a tool for humiliation. This event would ultimately lead Lorgar and his legion down a very dark path, where they would eventually swear allegiance to Horus over the Emperor at the onset of the Horus Heresy. Horus knew that Robute would never turn against the Emperor's ideals, and the Ultramarines, being the largest of the legions, was the greatest obstacle in his path to victory. This led to the Battle of Kolth, which was intended to be less of a battle and more of a massacre. Horus, still ostensibly acting as War Master of the Crusade, directed Robute and the Ultramarines to gather on the planet Kolth, to prepare for what he claimed would be an orc incursion. He also directed Lorgar's Word-Bearers Legion to gather there as well, although Robute assumed that this was all more of a flexing of authority on Horus's part rather than a real war. Regardless, he was ignorant of Horus's treachery and obeyed without question, gathering 20 of his legion's 22 chapters on the planet. Prior to the start of the battle, the Word-Bearers began gathering their forces into position and performing a number of chaos rituals that would unleash havoc across the planet. The Ultramarines failed to notice any of the treachery afoot, and the massacre began with the Word-Bearers sending a ship full speed into Kolth's primary shipyard, annihilating numerous warships and killing thousands. A massive electromagnetic pulse was released that disabled the majority of the remaining ships and Kolth's weapons grid. The Word-Bearers' fleet then opened fire on the Ultramarines' disabled ships, the resulting wreckages plummeting to the planet's surface and causing more devastation and tsunamis. Some of the Ultramarines believed that they were under attack from a third party and moved to join forces with the Word-Bearers, who swiftly massacred them. From the bridge of his disabled flagship, Robute quickly understood that it was the Word-Bearers that were attacking them, but attributed it to a mistake on Lorgar's part rather than any malice. When Lorgar refused to stop the attack after a direct communication between the two, however, Robute reluctantly authorized his troops to defend themselves, and the battle began. The Word-Bearers' ambush managed to slaughter at least half of the Ultramarine forces present on Kolth, but thanks to the incredible fighting spirit of the Ultramarines, the battle began to proceed at a different pace. During their communication, Lorgar informed Robute with amusement that he and other legions had joined with Horus to oppose the Emperor, and had already performed similar massacres elsewhere. Lorgar then spoke an incantation, summoning a swarm of demons that swiftly attacked Robute's ship, before leaving command of the battle to his second-in-command, Cor Pharon. Lorgar proceeded to take part of his forces deeper into Ultramar to wipe out Macragge, the remaining Ultramarines, and their gene seed. The demons that attacked Robute's flagship managed to crack open the bridge, venting it to space. Robute was thrown outside into the vacuum of space without a helmet, but his Primarch physiology allowed him to survive for hours, even managing to kill several word-bearers with his bare hands. The demons were eventually cleared from the ship, and Robute led a force of 50 Ultramarines onto Kolth's orbital platform in order to retake control of it from Kor Pharon. Kor Pharon, however, managed to momentarily stun Robute with powers granted to him by the warp, but rather than killing him, he hoped to use a ritual knife to convert him to chaos, much like Horus had been. Robute proved to be made of sterner stuff, however, and instead ripped Pharon's primary heart from his chest, driving him and his elite guard from the platform. The tide of the battle slowly turned, as Robute ordered his flagship to pursue Pharon as they fled. Pharon had tried to use the orbital platform's weapons to cause the nearby star to go supernova, but instead only managed to damage it, resulting in it bombarding Kolth with lethal radiation. Robute ordered the fleet to evacuate the system, although this meant that the survivors on the planet would be forced to go underground for months or years until the fleet could return to extract them, continuing to fight against the surviving word-bearers in what was known as the Underground War. Despite his legion being in shambles and the battle being barely won, Robute had bigger concerns on his mind, principally the fact that Lorgar was in the process of launching an offensive into the rest of Ultramar. In what would become known as the Shadow Crusade, Lorgar's goal was to create a massive warp storm known as the Ruin Storm, which would cut off Ultramar from Terra. To do so, Lorgar needed to unleash a campaign of wanton bloodshed, so he joined forces with his brother Angron and his legion, the World Eaters. Robute eventually arrived, however, and another pitched battle ensued, culminating in a duel between Robute and Lorgar that was surprisingly even-matched. This changed, though, when Angron joined, swiftly defeating Robute in a furious rage, his life only being saved by the intervention of some nearby Ultramarines. In a ritual fueled by Angron's rage afterwards, he was transformed into a demon Primarch of Khorne. Additionally, the Ruin Storm was a success, cutting off Ultramar from the rest of the Imperium, so Robute fled back to Macragge to consider the situation. Using a recovered piece of Necron tech called the Pharos, Robute was able to draw in a number of his loyalist allies, including Lion L. Johnson and Sanguinius. Since none of them were aware of the situation in the rest of the Imperium, Robute decided to prepare for the worst-case scenario, that being Terra and the Emperor falling. Even if this were to occur, however, the battle must go on, and the Imperium must be rebuilt, so Robute formed a backup Imperium, the Imperium Secundus. Robute didn't want to fall into the same trap as Horus, though, so he refused to crown himself as the Emperor of the new Imperium, instead proposing that Lion L. Johnson rule. Ultimately, however, the duty fell on Sanguinius, who was reluctant to accept it, with Robute becoming Lord Warden and L. Johnson being Lord Protector, similar to the War Master. Robute frequently clashed with L. Johnson over policy, aggravated by the fact that the Primarch Conrad Kurz was somewhere on Macragge, spreading chaos and inciting rebellions. L. Johnson established martial law without Robute's express permission, but eventually Kurz was captured. Before long, it became clear that the Emperor and Terra still stood, and the three Primarchs agreed to try and breach the Ruin Storm in order to reach Terra. The process wasn't simple, with Robute surviving another assassination attempt and L. Johnson nearly ordering a planet to be subjected to exterminatus, even though Sanguinius was still on it. They nearly made it through a breach in the ruin storm that led to Terra, but Horus had somehow foreseen this route and left a large blockade to stop them. Robute and L. Johnson agreed to distract the blockade, while Sanguinius and the Blood Angels traveled directly to Terra. The Blood Angels made it to Terra to play an instrumental part in the siege. Well, not long after, the ruin storm dissipated, opening up access to the rest of the Imperium once more. Robute gathered what forces he could to make a swift flight to Terra, but unfortunately in his path lay a defensive chain of hundreds of worlds manned by Perturabo's legion, the Iron Warriors. Robute's legion continued to suffer more casualties, but maintained a slow and steady advance towards Terra. Near the end of the siege of Terra, when the traitor forces were near victory, Horus managed to intercept a message from Robute, learning that he and his forces were a mere 9 hours away from arriving at Terra. Knowing that the arrival of Robute and the Ultramarines could very well spell doom for Horus's attempt at taking over the Imperium, he decided on a bold gambit. He would lower his flagship's shields and invite the Emperor to teleport aboard the ship. His plan was to slay the Emperor before Robute could arrive, and with the Emperor dead, the Ultramarines and other legions would lose heart and scatter. What followed, of course, was Horus and Sanguinius dying aboard the ship, and the Emperor being gravely wounded, with Robute arriving only a short time afterwards. With the war technically won, but Terra and the Imperium in ruins, Robute refused to allow the Empire to fall. He took control over the Council of Terra, establishing the position of the Lord Commander of the Imperium, and dispatched his remaining Ultramarines across the Imperium to regain control and maintain order. Thanks to Ultramar continuing to be the most effective means of recruiting among the remaining Loyalist legions, the Ultramarines comprised the majority of Space Marines across the Imperium. After decades of fighting, a semblance of order and stability returned to the Imperium, and Robute decided that a change needed to be made to the legions of Astartes. One of the biggest problems with Horus's rebellion was that he was able to sway entire legions to his side as a collective, giving him massive amounts of forces. In addition, the Imperial Army at the time consisted of both ground forces and the Navy, making it a devastating force in its own right. First, Robute split the army into two separate organizations, the Imperial Guard and the Imperial Navy. Second, Robute proceeded to compose and formalize a great tome, known as the Codex Astartes. The purpose of this document was twofold. One, to divide the existing Space Marine legions into numerous chapters of 1,000 warriors, and two, to present a code of conduct for Robute's ideal behavior and doctrine. These new Space Marine chapters would each be led by a single chapter master that answers only to the Emperor himself, and each chapter would be responsible for their own recruitment, training, and war gear. This way, no single individual, save the Emperor himself, could ever control more than 1,000 Space Marines directly. While the mandate of splitting into smaller chapters was mandatory for all the legions, the enforcement of the doctrine and traditions of the Codex Astartes has been less strict. Some chapters adhere as close as possible to the Codex, none more than Robute's personal chapter, the Ultramarines, while others deviate quite a bit. At the time of the Codex's implementation, most of the legions were so sparse that they split into only a handful of smaller chapters, while the Ultramarines legion split into at least 20. Over the millennia, this overall number has obviously swelled, and in the present day, it's believed that there are around 1,000 total Space Marine chapters. At some point during all of this, Robute went to the tech priest, Belisarius Call, and tasked him with two great projects. One being to figure out a way to resurrect Robute should he ever fall, and two, to create the next generation of Space Marines. Surprisingly, not long after this, Robute participated in a great battle against his brother Fulgrim and the Emperor's children. Fulgrim had been transformed by Slanesh into a mighty demon prince and managed to stab Robute in the neck with a poisoned sword. Robute was managed to be interred in a stasis field just at the moment of his death and was taken deep into the Temple of Correction on Macragge. Here, he remained for 10,000 years, with the shrine becoming one of the holiest places in the entire Imperium, welcoming millions of pilgrims every year. In the meantime, Call continued to experiment and research, and eventually, at the dawn of the 42nd millennium, just as Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade came to an end amidst Cadia's destruction, the time came for Robute's reawakening. Call, with the aid of some Eldar assistants, used a power suit that managed to regenerate the wounds inflicted by Fulgrim, and he was brought out of stasis just as Black Legion forces invaded Macragge. Robute swiftly drove off the invaders, but afterwards came to learn what had happened to the Imperium in his 10,000-year absence. While the Imperium he had left was one founded on logic and reason, he was disgusted now to find it steeped in superstition, fear, and ignorance. He swiftly set out for Terra to meet with his father upon the Golden Throne, but was immediately beset on the journey by the forces of Chaos, who had of course noticed his revival. Robute's journey back to Terra became known as the Terran Crusade, as his fleet became trapped in the massive warp storm known as the Maelstrom, thanks to an ambush set by Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons. Inside the Maelstrom, his fleet was defeated by the personal vizier of the Chaos god Tzeentch, and Robute was captured and held inside of a black stone fortress. With some assistance from some unlikely allies, Robute managed to escape with the rest of the survivors of the fleet through a webway portal that eventually led to Luna, Terra's moon. Here, Robute dueled Magnus as battle raged around them, although Robute was soon overwhelmed by Magnus's psychic abilities. Despite this, he managed to hold him off long enough for reinforcements to arrive from Terra, ending the Terran Crusade. On Terra, Robute stood before the Golden Throne, and the Emperor awoke for the first time in a millennia. What followed was a surreal experience that Robute can't fully remember, but the Emperor told him that he was the last hope to save mankind, before brutally assaulting his mind with dark truths of the galaxy and its history. A witness to the event, the Captain General of the Emperor's Custodes, said that Robute spoke in silent psychic conversation with the Emperor for several minutes, while Robute seems to remember falling to the ground in agony. Despite only minutes seeming to pass for them, when they emerged from the throne room, over a day had passed. Regardless, Robute emerged with a new determination, and gathered the High Lords of Terra to declare himself the Lord Commander once more, and that the Imperium would be reorganized to better face the coming threat of chaos. Following the destruction of Cadia at the end of the 13th Black Crusade, a new tear in reality was created, known as the Great Rift, that divided the Imperium in half, leaving countless worlds in hopeless darkness. Robute declared a new crusade to reclaim these worlds, known as the Indomitus Crusade, and brought about two big changes. First was the introduction of Call's second project, a new generation of Space Marines, known as the Primaris Space Marines. To create these, Call was given access to the genetic information of all 20 Primarchs, and used several unique STCs in the process, blueprints from mankind's height of technological progress. Because of this, the Primaris Marines are larger, more powerful, and more stable than the prior generation, and soon the grand majority of chapters welcomed Primaris Marines into their ranks. The second thing that Robute set out to create was a set of sweeping civic reforms. Just as the Codex Astartes was meant to be Robute's ultimate declaration of military doctrine and organization, he began to write a similar document for the Imperium in general, known as the Codex Imperialis, which would also contain the first reliable history of the Imperium they've had in 10,000 years. The Indomitus Crusade continued for a number of years, with Robute at the front of it, until he could no longer ignore the threat of the Chaos God Nurgle and his brother Primarch Mortarion, who were seeking to take claim over the worlds of Ultramar. Mortarion and his Death Guard launched a large-scale invasion of Ultramar in a conflict known as the Plague Wars, aided by the Plague Father and his demonic legions. Robute swiftly returned home and began beating back the invaders, thanks to the assistance of various other Ultramarine successor chapters and reinforcements from Forge Worlds. The invasion was soon looking to be a failure for Mortarion, although Robute was led into a trap set by Mortarion and Nurgle's second-in-command. Robute was nearly slain, but was saved by the power of what appeared to be a living saint in the form of a young girl, who drove the forces of Nurgle back. Later, during the final battle of the Plague Wars, Robute was led into another trap, in which Mortarion hoped to kill him with a powerful disease known as the God Blight. Robute knew that he was walking into the trap, but also knew that he had to stop Mortarion, and so a fateful duel occurred. Thanks to his warp-enhanced strength and resilience, Mortarion managed to pin Robute to the ground and administer the God Blight. Once again, Robute was caught between life and death, but in that moment, he experienced a vision of his last meeting with the Emperor, and awoke infused with power. He was able to channel the Emperor's energy himself, and struck a grievous blow to Nurgle's realm within the warp directly. Mortarion fled with the remainder of his forces, bringing an end to the Plague Wars. Afterwards, Robute oversaw the rebuilding and decontamination of the worlds of Ultramar, but soon set back out on the Crusade once more. History is still being written, of course, for Warhammer 40k, but in the present day, Robute is almost certainly the most important active figure in the entire Imperium, a shining beacon of order and strength amidst a period of darkness and uncertainty. He's made some mistakes, but there's practically no one better suited to lead the Imperium in the Emperor's wake, and with the Great Rift still in place, Robute's downfall would spell very dire times for the Imperium. The Ultramarines are pretty much the poster children for Warhammer 40k, meaning that their founder was always going to be one of the most important figures in the franchise. It's hard to say if he'll be around forever, as one can only handle so many near-death experiences, but being infused with both the power of the Emperor of Mankind as well as plot armor is certainly a potent combination. While his future is unclear, however, his past stands for itself, and Robute Guilliman has absolutely managed to leave his mark on the Imperium. Psykers. Warhammer 40k is generally associated with grim darkness and advanced technology and weaponry. When most people think of the setting, they think of Space Marines, bolters, mechs, giant ships, tanks, alien tools of war, and so on. 40K, however, is pretty firmly set between science fiction and fantasy, and it has no shortage of fantastical elements, especially if you look outside of the Imperium. Perhaps one of the most obvious fantasy elements is that of the presence of psychers, individuals capable of wielding psychic energy in some way. While certainly not as straight science fiction as spaceships and warp drives, and not as directly in the forefront of marketing as Space Marines and Bolters, psychers are an integral aspect of the setting, and it would pretty much cease to exist as we know it without them. Let's take a look at what a psyker is and can do, and how they're each represented in the various factions. Let's begin with what exactly a psyker is. The term itself is really only used within the Imperium of mankind, although its broad definition of an entity capable of utilizing the energy of the warp within their minds to project psychic powers fits into practically every species and faction in some way. To put it bluntly, psychers are essentially the magic wielders of the 40K universe, although naturally the nature of these psychic abilities is far more grim and dangerous than a traditional fantasy setting. Psychic powers are extremely vast and varied in their applications and presentations, with no set limits on what exactly a powerful psyker is capable of. There are a number of common disciplines, however, seen across different species across the galaxy, with the 5 most common being biomancy, divination, pyromancy, telekinesis, and telepathy. Biomancy is the manipulation of biological energy and processes. A biomancer is capable of changing the physical form in some way of themselves or their enemies, such as rapidly healing injuries, regrowing body parts, shapeshifting, increasing or decreasing someone's strength or speed, or just physically harming an individual, likely by turning their own body against them. Divination is the art of using the warp to glean information about the past and the future, with a battlefield diviner capable of foreseeing exactly when and how an opponent will act. Pyromancy is, of course, the ability to create and manipulate fire psychically, with pyromancers capable of sending out torrents of flame across a battlefield, or even transforming themselves into pure flames. Psychers gifted with telekinesis are able to convert their mental energies into physical force, lifting and throwing large objects with their minds, creating psychic barriers, or simply manipulating their enemies' bodies directly. Telepaths, on the other hand, can manipulate their enemies' minds directly, inducing paranoia, confusion, fatigue, or bolstering their allies' minds instead. No 2 psychers are alike, however, especially those of different species, so while they may share the same discipline, the manifestation of their psychic abilities could still vary greatly. As mentioned, there is also no real limit to the array of psychic abilities across the galaxy, so those 5 are only the most common disciplines, at least as far as the battlefield is concerned. Let's move on to discussing how psychers operate and appear within each faction and species, starting with the Imperium. Within humans, the ability to mentally draw upon the energy of the warp is a genetic mutation, one that first appeared at some point in humanity's ancient past, possibly since the Neolithic Age. Towards the end of the 22nd millennium, however, large amounts of psychers started to pop up across practically every human-settled world within a relatively short span of time. At the time, this was believed to be a crucial step in humanity's slow evolution towards becoming a fully psychic species, much like the Eldari, all of whom are born with psychic capabilities to some degree. Unfortunately, this evolutionary process has been uneven, and humanity continues to lack the mental development necessary to fully control their psychic abilities. Additionally, humans are relatively easily corrupted by the entities of chaos, and psychers, especially due to their interactions with the warp, represent a constant threat, if not controlled. For these reasons, The Emperor of Mankind largely banned the usage of any psychic powers in the Imperium outside of a few notable exceptions. Therefore, most psychers across the Imperium are distrusted and seen as dangerous mutants, even those serving the Imperium in an official capacity. This official capacity is largely overseen by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, a branch of the government responsible for the recruitment and training of psychers. This process begins with the Black Ships, a fleet that traverses the Imperium constantly to transport anyone showcasing a degree of psychic potential. Any given planet in the Imperium is visited around once every 100 years by a black ship, at which point the planetary governor will have to pay a tithe of psychers. Once a black ship is filled with psychers, contained in anti-psychic cells, the ship will return to Terra to deliver them to the Scholastica Psychana, along with any other psychers collected by Inquisitors, the Adeptus Arbites, or through any other means. Once in the Scholastica, every psycher will undergo an evaluation to determine their psychic potential and their character. Generally, youth are preferred here, as they are the easiest to train and indoctrinate, and will undergo a process known as soul binding, in which a tiny portion of the Emperor's immense soul is bound to their own, to strengthen their resistance against the powers of chaos. Most psychers, however, do not fit the bill for official service, due to being too weak in ability, too dangerous to train, too old to change, or for some other reason. These unfortunate individuals are then sent over to the Golden Throne, the mechanism upon which the Emperor of Mankind sits, and which is responsible for keeping the Emperor alive, allowing him to direct the beacon of the Astronomicon, making interstellar warp travel possible across the Imperium, and combating the forces of chaos that would seek to invade Terra through the Webway. This is an immensely draining task, as Malkador, the most powerful human psyker to ever live, only managed to sit on the throne for a few hours in the Emperor's absence before his body and soul were consumed, while the Emperor has been on it for millennia. To maintain the Emperor's capabilities, he requires the constant daily sacrifice of psychers, a number that was originally around 1,000 every day, but at the present time is now up to around 4,000 every day. These psychers are those with no other use in the Imperium, and the process to sacrifice them to the Emperor requires them to be in a great deal of pain as they die, so that they lash out with psychic energy, which is then absorbed and transferred by specialized machinery. This is the primary purpose of the Black Ships, because if the Emperor ever fails in his duties on the Golden Throne, the Imperium of Mankind is pretty much over. Those that aren't sacrificed for the greater good are trained and conditioned to serve the Imperium as sanctioned psychers. Their exact role will depend on their psychic strength and their character, but the most common position for a sanctioned psyker in the Imperium is that of an astropath. These are the individuals responsible for interstellar communication across the Imperium, a vital role due to the sheer size of the Empire. Astropathic communication is an exhausting process that requires as much work to transmit as it does to decode, since messages often appear in the form of dreams or visions rather than simple words. Some messages might take weeks to reconstruct and decipher, while others might remain a mystery forever, so a talented astropath is an extremely valuable asset. Many fringe worlds don't possess any astropath whatsoever, instead relying on passing ships to make contact with the outside galaxy, meaning that often events can come and go without anyone else in the Imperium being aware. In addition to the thousands of psychers sacrificed to continue to empower the Emperor, a great number of trained astropaths must continue to power the Astronomicon itself so that it continues to function. This is a highly draining process, and around 1,000 astropaths perish every day in the process. Another extremely important psychic role aboard most ships is that of a navigator, the individuals responsible for charting a course through the warp during jumps. While this is technically a psychic power, and navigators are considered mutants for that reason, they don't possess any other psychic powers outside of their warp eye, a mutation on their foreheads that allows them to gaze into the warp and guide starships through it. This is a genetic mutation, passed down through interbreeding amongst navigators, and controlled by a union of noble families called the Navis Nobilite. While some ships don't strictly require a navigator if they stick to short-range, calculated jumps along known routes, most of the Imperial Navy vessels do have a navigator on board, making them immensely valuable to the Imperium's existence. Beyond that, psychers prepared for a more militaristic role may end up being placed in a squad of the Imperial Guard, positioned as both psychic advisors to officers and weapons on the battlefield. As mentioned, being able to predict enemy movements, bolster allies' morale, or launch bolts of lightning from their hands makes them potentially extremely useful in a battle. Unfortunately, usage of psychic powers puts them at risk, both mentally and physically, and there have even been cases where a psyker's body has overloaded with warp energy, exploding and taking out entire Imperial Guard squads. Because of this, and due to the overall distrust of mutants in the Imperium, sanctioned psychers in the Guard are at best tolerated and at worst loathed by guardsmen. They're never allowed to stray far from their assigned commissar, who will very likely execute them at the slightest sign of warp taint. This is a common demise for sanctioned psychers in the Guard, and has earned them the nickname of bolt magnets. If they manage to survive a full term of service with the Guard, they'll return to the Astra Telepathica, where they will undergo rigorous tests in order to potentially become a Primaris Psyker. These elite individuals are afforded a lot more responsibility and respect, being deemed to possess a greater deal of control over their abilities, and are often attached to high-ranking Imperial Guard officers or Inquisitors. Powerful Psychers might end up becoming Inquisitors themselves, as many members of the Inquisition are potent Psychers, despite their steadfast goal in rooting out rogue Psychers. Finally, as expected, the greatest of the Psychers trained by the Scholastica might end up being selected by a Space Marine chapter to become a Librarian, the pinnacle of psychic potential within the Imperium. Many Space Marine chapters will also seek out potential psychic recruits from the same place they seek out other initiates, generally Death, Feral, and Hive worlds, where the strong are naturally separated from the weak. Those psychic recruits that survive the training and implant process, with their minds and bodies intact, will generally be managed by the chapter's chief librarian. Their duties, to begin with, will often involve the endless task of maintaining, studying, and cataloging the vast amounts of text within the Librarius, the chapter's knowledge base. They will also be expected to enter into battle with their brothers, using their psychic abilities to aid the chapter in times of crisis. If they continue to survive and grow in experience and control, they will rise in rank, eventually becoming the most potent psychers amidst the Imperium, and acting as psychic communications officers for the chapter. The Chief Librarian is the greatest among these, with some chapters' chief librarians said to be the most powerful psychers in the galaxy, aside from the Emperor. There are, of course, some chapters that deviate from this basic organization, such as the Space Wolves, who have no librarius and instead have rune priests that operate in battle similar to librarians, or the Storm Seers of the White Scars, who believe that their powers are connected to the animistic spirits of the land and air. The Grey Knights chapter is a rather unique one, deserving of its own video, but they are a secretive chapter created by the Emperor and Malkador during the Horus Heresy to combat the demonic forces of chaos. They act as the military arm of the Ordo Malleus of the Inquisition, and every single one of their members is a potent psyker, with no recorded example of any Grey Knight succumbing to chaos corruption. This is perhaps due to their gene seed being taken from the Emperor himself, although, since a number of the Primarchs fell to chaos, the real reason is perhaps unknowable. Since all of the Grey Knights are psychers, they wield unique psychic-based weaponry into battle, such as the Psi Cannon, which fires ritually inscribed, psychically charged bolts, and Nemesis Force weapons, extremely rare weapons whose power directly corresponds to the wielder's psychic potential, making them highly deadly weapons in the hands of the Grey Knights. Of course, the Imperium isn't the only faction possessing psychic might. As mentioned, the Eldar possess a special gift for psychic potential, with every Eldari being psychic to some degree, although the ones that harness that ability for warfare spend a great deal of time honing and training their ability. This massive psychic potential is a constant concern, however, especially when considering that the Eldari of the past gave birth to a new Chaos God, so the present-day Eldar must remain highly disciplined and regulated. Those Eldari who choose to devote their lives to augmenting and harnessing their psychic abilities are known as Seers, considered to be the most dangerous path a craft world Eldari can walk, due to the threat of the Chaos Gods. This path is only undertaken by those who have already mastered at least one other path in their lifetime, as it would be foolish to take a youth and open their mind to the warp without them having mastered themselves first. Most Eldari possess a visceral fear of drawing Slaanesh's attention, so very few end up becoming Seers. In keeping with this idea of highly cautious and ritualized psychic use, Seers don't open their minds directly to the warp in the same way that Imperial Psychers do, but rather utilize runes to draw and store warp energy. By meditating upon a rune and combining different runes, a Seer can use the contained warp energy to create powerful rituals, the process of which allows them to mentally reach the correct mindset to unleash the power, meaning that the Seer can manifest the ritual without risk. There is a risk, however, when a Seer must learn from another Seer how to use a rune they haven't mastered yet, or even worse, if they need to create a new rune to make a new ritual, a process that can cause a Seer to struggle to find the correct mindset for the ritual, opening them up to peril. While all Seers are capable of a myriad of psychic abilities, depending on their past experiences and role within each craft world, there are a number of more dedicated roles that a Seer may end up walking. A Bone Singer is the engineer and craftsman of the craft world Eldari, using their psychic abilities to create and manipulate Wraith Bone, which is crystallized warp energy. While all Eldari are able to psychically influence Wraithbone in some ways, Bone Singers are those that focus on its mastery, creating and repairing weapons, armor, vehicles, constructs, and even the craft worlds themselves out of the substance. Warlocks are those that have previously walked the path of the warrior, and now use their psychic powers in battle, harnessing their most destructive impulses. In addition to utilizing the psychic runes to summon shields of energy around themselves or unleash blasts of energy, warlocks also wield a powerful force weapon, known as a Witch Blade, focusing the warlock's psychic force to strike with a devastating burst that can incinerate enemies instantly. Finally, Farseers are the most potent psychers amidst the Eldari, with a council of them generally governing each craft world. Their most powerful ability is that of divination, allowing Farseers to peer into the future on a large scale to ensure that the remaining Eldari do not suffer any more great losses. Much of their time is spent in a trance-like state, as their spirit roams throughout the wraithbone of their craft world, although they can be called into battle if absolutely necessary, utilizing immense psychic potential to unleash storms of eldritch energy. Much like the Imperium's chief librarians, Farseers number amongst the most potent psykers in the galaxy. In contrast, the Drukhari, or Dark Eldar, have practically no psykers amongst their number. The innate psychic abilities of the Eldar have atrophied within the Dark Eldar, partly due to their focus on physical athleticism, and partly due to them fearing the attention of Slaanesh even more than the Craftworld Eldari. For this reason, the usage of psychic powers is one of the few things forbidden in their capital city, Camorra. Shadow Seers, however, members of the independent subset of Eldar known as Harlequins, are potent psykers focusing on spreading confusion and fear, and while they are allowed to travel openly within Camorra, they are often distrusted. As expected, the forces of chaos include a great deal of individuals with psychic potential, with the most common being sorcerers, capable of summoning demons and unleashing devastating psychic powers on a battlefield. The most potent of chaos psykers worship the chaos god Tzeentch, who is devoted to sorcery, and often gifts powerful psychic abilities to his followers. Unlike Imperial psykers, who must restrain themselves lest they be corrupted by chaos, chaos sorcerers are already corrupted and empowered by the energies of the warp, allowing them to unleash horrific powers with little regard for the consequences. That being said, sorcerers are not necessarily mad, and must still resist the dangers of overusage of the warp if they want to maintain their grip on reality. Additionally, demons of the warp have no qualms about feasting on their own, and any psychic usage can draw them in. Mutation and degeneration are also constant dangers, as a powerful spell gone awry can easily turn a powerful sorcerer into a mindless chaos spawn, capable of being little more than cannon fodder in future battles. Orcs are another innately psychic species, in a similar way to the Eldari, but they possess far less control over their psychic abilities. Instead, each orc unconsciously generates a psychic energy field, known as Wa. This field grows more potent and intense when more and more orcs gather together and get excited, especially while fighting, which is what gives the orcs momentum to continue along on a military campaign, also called a Wa. It's theorized that this psychic field is what allows the ramshackle and poorly designed orc technology to actually function, as orcs believe that something should work, so it works. Many orc-built weapons will not function at all unless wielded by an orc, so it would seem that orcs' psychic abilities are integral to their entire way of life. Orcs also possess their own psykers, however, known as Weird Boys, that are capable of absorbing the psychic energy generated by other orcs and expelling it, generally in a violent manner. Weird Boys have very little control over this ability, and will unconsciously absorb any psychic emissions from nearby orcs, forcing them to expel it in some way, or else their own heads will explode. This absorption is not an enjoyable process for them, and most Weird Boys have to be forced onto a battlefield, driven mad by the massive amounts of psychic energy forced into them. During a full-scale war, many of them will either flee or get caught up in a suicidal frenzy, becoming extremely dangerous psychic weapons. Weird Boys in general are disliked by other orcs, and kept apart from them in encampments, where they are guarded by a couple of minders. The most potent of the Weird Boys are known as Warp Heads, those that have survived enough battles to become saturated with the warp, and actually come to enjoy the usage of their powers. Perhaps the most psychically active race in the entire galaxy are the Tyranids, as every single Tyranid is telepathically connected to all other Tyranids through the hive mind. The hive mind is said to be an entity of pure psychic energy that originated outside of the Milky Way galaxy and acts through the hive tyrants, which in turn command every other Tyranid around them. The hive mind's potent psychic ability causes it to disrupt the normal flow of psychic energy within the immaterium, much in the same way as a warp storm, an effect known as the shadow in the warp. It uses this when it unleashes a hive fleet, cutting off astropathic communications and reinforcements, making Tyranid invasions especially deadly. It even affects individuals in the area, manifesting as a malaise that can't be shaken, amplified if the person has any psychic potential. Most Tyranids do not possess any psychic abilities outside of this constant telepathy, but zoanthropes are powerful psychers engineered from harvested Eldari DNA. They are capable of firing powerful warp blasts that can kill a space marine, and can levitate over a battlefield to rain down psychic power. They also can create bubbles of warp energy around themselves, shielding them from damage and making them very hard to kill. That being said, they are still susceptible to burning themselves out, much like most other psychers, and their craniums have been observed to burst if they overuse their abilities. There also exist much larger Tyranids, such as the Norn Queens, that are presumed to be psychers of immense power, but the full extent of their abilities is still unknown. Additionally, some members of the Gene Stealers, a subsect of Tyranids designed to infiltrate other species' worlds, can develop psychic powers similar to a psyker. These creatures, called Maguses, use these powers for both domination, to build a Gene Stealer cult and amass power, and for warfare. Lastly, the Tau and the Necron are two factions that possess no psychic abilities amongst their number, for different reasons. The Necrons are a species of machine constructs that gave up their souls long ago, cutting them off entirely from utilizing psychic abilities. They cannot sense or influence the warp in any way innately, and thus hate and fear it, utilizing technology specifically designed for destroying psychers. The Necrons had never had much love for the powers of the warp, however, as long ago they battled against the Old Ones, who possessed extremely potent psychic powers and were responsible for creating the Webway and the Eldari species. The Tau have so far not developed any psychers of their own, and in fact are naturally resistant to the mutating effects of chaos. It was originally believed that the Tau Ethereals, the ruling class of the Tau, possessed some psychic ability, as they're able to maintain absolute authority over the other Tau castes. This was later determined to be related to an unknown organ in the center of their foreheads, a larger version than those possessed by other Tau castes. Psychers are a potent asset across most factions of Warhammer 40k, from Imperial astropaths that allow for interstellar communication, to orc weird boys capable of leveling a battlefield in explosive blasts of psychic energy. One theme that runs through all of it, however, is the inherent danger in utilizing psychic abilities, even amongst the forces of chaos. Great power at great cost is certainly the idea of psychers, and while enough psychic energy gathered together could theoretically do just about anything, it could also just as easily spawn a new Chaos God, or worse. The Emperor of Mankind remains an unparalleled psycher, and it's unlikely that any individual will ever come close to his capabilities, but more and more psychers are popping up across the galaxy, and that much interaction with the warp is probably not a good thing, especially if it's not kept on a tight leash. At the end of the day, though, psychers are cool because magic is cool, and it's at its coolest when someone is raining down psychic death on a battlefield. An overview of Imperial worlds. The scale of the Warhammer 40k universe is, in a word, comical. There are quadrillions of humans living across the galaxy on over 1 million different planets, to the point where the population of an entire planet being wiped out is just a small blip on a ledger somewhere. The Imperium of mankind is an endless war machine, and so the grand majority of the Imperium's planets are devoted to continuing this war machine's existence in some way. From fresh soldiers, to weapons and vehicles, to food, and even faith, every planet serves some sort of purpose in the overall scheme, and more often than not, any given planet is dedicated to serving one or two functions over anything else. This leads us into the classification system used by the Imperium to denote a planet's primary function or characteristic. So let's go over a brief overview of the various types of planets seen across the Imperium. It should be noted, to start, that these classifications are quite broad, and a planet can certainly possess characteristics belonging to multiple classifications, or serve multiple purposes. A hive world, which is primarily associated with hosting a massive amount of people, also produces a huge quantity of materials, just not as high of quality as a forge world, and produces a solid number of potential soldiers, just perhaps not as brutal and hardy as those from feral worlds. With that segue then, let's discuss hive worlds, which are estimated to be the classification for somewhere between 10 to 25% of the total quantity of Imperial planets. Hive worlds earn their name due to their defining feature, the presence of massive hive cities, huge accretions of urban sprawl stacked into the sky, housing billions of people each. While most Imperial planets contain at least one hive cluster, hive worlds contain thousands of these cities, covering the entire planet in metal and pollutants. These cities consist of many layers, with the poorest and most dangerous individuals residing in the lowest layer, the underhive, while the upper class live easy lives in the upper hive. Most hive worlders work in factories, producing mountains of material and other basic goods in order to reach the demand of the Imperial tithe, or are sent off to join up with the Imperial Guard or Navy. While the quality of the goods produced here doesn't compare to a forge world, it's been said that the sacrifice of over 1 million Imperial soldiers is worth 1 day of a hive world's production in weapons and armor. Obviously, the conditions of the average hive world can't be understated, and are nightmarish for the lower class. Most hive worlders will never even see the sky, let alone leave the city level on which they are born, with their job decided even before then. They'll work tirelessly through their entire miserable lives, unless they're shipped off to die in a war on some other planet, and that's certainly the better option. Nearly everything within a hive city is recycled and reused, from the air, the water, the food, to their clothes and possessions. Everything will have either been owned by another hive worlder previously, or will have already gone through someone else's body before being recycled over and over. The hive cities and their endless factories pollute the ground of the planet to a degree where nothing could ever hope to grow, so nearly all food has to be imported from agri-worlds, but there's rarely enough for the billions of people in each city. Instead, when a hive worlder dies, their bodies are recycled to produce corpse starch, a synthetic foodstuff that's necessary to keep others alive so that they can continue to work. Mutants, violent gangs, and crime of every imaginable sort run rampant throughout the Underhive, making them popular locations for chaos cultists to work their dark ways. Despite the near totalitarian control of the levels above the Underhive, catastrophic unrest does sometimes occur, and a widespread riot can easily bring about the collapse of a hive city. Hive worlds are an unfortunate necessity as far as the Imperium is concerned, as the sheer quantity of bodies and materials they produce is worth the suffering. But there are far better worlds for the average human to reside on. As mentioned, agri-worlds are obviously extremely important to the Imperium as well, providing all of the food for the rest of humanity. An agri-world is defined as any planet in which at least 85% of it is devoted to crop cultivation, hydroponics, animal fodder, or animal husbandry, and the population of these worlds generally consists of between 15,000 and 1 million people, spread across the entire planet. While it might be nice to imagine them as tranquil worlds of quiet farming and animals roaming the pastures, obviously these worlds are mercilessly industrialized and enforced to ensure that the tithes are always met. When the Imperium first finds a candidate for an agri-world, depending on its size, location, and soil quality, they first terraform the planet, scrubbing all pre-existing life through controlled virus chewers or by timed flame drops. The atmosphere is then regulated. Weather essentially disappears, replaced by controlled rain governed by satellites, and the empty landscape is divided up into colossal production zones, each patrolled by crawlers and pest-thopters. Millions of base-level servitors are imported, genetically engineered cybernetic slaves, kept at the very lowest level of cognitive function, but bulked up by a ruthless level of muscle binders. Soon after the terraforming process is completed, every agri-world looks exactly the same, consisting of a flat plain of high-yield crops as far as the eye can see. The industrial fertilizer dumps are so powerful here that they turn the air orange and make it impossible to breathe unfiltered, and a single growing season exhausts the soil completely, requiring continual delivery of more sprays of nitrates and phosphates. The planet will be driven like this for thousands of years until it eventually breaks down and becomes a dead world, and although the quality of crops will get steadily worse, the quantity can be sustained almost indefinitely. At the end of each season, great harvester leviathans, the smallest of which are 100 meters long, are used to suck up every last speck of grain, which are then taken into the city-sized processor vats, blasted with antibiotics, smashed, burned, crushed, and then stamped and packaged. Despite the common imperial propaganda of agri-worlds as bucolic lands where you can live outdoors with the sun on your back, life on an agri-world is an unrelenting, back-breaking, and monotonous existence, consisting of punishing work details in rad suits. There's a saying among the indentured workers that end up on one: you come for the soil, and you end up part of it. Survival certainly has its price, which for the Imperium is largely paid by its unfortunate common population. No doubt a better place for a human to live in the Imperium is on a feudal world, which is the designation for any planet with a human population in which their level of technology doesn't go above crude, black powder firearms or so. These pre-industrial worlds typically have a population somewhere between 10 million and 500 million, and generally have little direct political or economic interference from the Imperium, and aren't required to pay quite as high of tithes. The people of a feudal world all owe allegiance to those above them, from the lowliest of peasants all the way up to the planetary governor, who often resides on an orbiting space station to avoid upsetting the cultural balance. This ensures that the entire population of the planet is stable and kept in line, with no random wars breaking out over territory disputes. Life here for most is simple, harsh, and demanding, But unlike most planets in the Imperium, feudal worlds are often self-sufficient, able to provide enough food for themselves, as well as some to pay the tithe, along with certain goods that would be unlikely to be found on other worlds, such as wooden furniture and pieces of art. Of course, soldiers are another popular export of feudal worlds, as even though they have to deal with a bit of culture shock from being introduced to the rest of the Imperium, the emphasis on nobility and honor makes them quite suitable for the Guard. They also are popular locations for various Space Marine chapters to find new recruits for similar reasons. Additionally, the more scholastic among them might end up joining the Adeptus Administratum, or the Imperial Creed. That being said, oftentimes the Imperium will discover a feudal world and decide to take it over completely, turning it into a forge world or an agri world in order to maximize production, rather than letting it remain a medieval society. The exceptions to this are often knight worlds, which are similarly feudal in nature, but which are ruled by noble houses that are trained in their ancestral combat walkers called Imperial Knights. These battlesuits hail from humanity's age of technology, and while the modern Imperium can make various versions of these knights, the real advantage of the knight houses is that they possess generations of individuals that will spend their lives training and bonding with the house's ancestral knights. Somewhat similar to feudal worlds in that they've been allowed to develop somewhat naturally rather than overhauled for a single purpose are the civilized worlds. These worlds are pretty common throughout the Imperium, often being self-sufficient and possessing a population anywhere from 15 million up to 10 billion. They pay a moderately high tithe to the Imperium and may possess large, sprawling urban areas, but haven't quite reached the levels of being true hive cities. These worlds are of course still ruled by a planetary governor, and will generally be aware of the overall Imperium, so they will have temples to the God Emperor and will be prepared to be shipped off to join the Guard. These worlds are widely varied, but the average one is probably pretty similar to our present-day Earth, making it certainly one of the safest and most pleasant locations for the average person to reside. On the flip side, we have feral worlds, the most primitive of the human worlds within the Imperium. The technological level of these worlds often resides within the Stone Age, and the population consists of hunter-gatherer societies using primitive tools and weapons. Assuming that the Imperium doesn't take over the planet for some other reason, such as the soil being abundant or rich mineral deposits, the world will be ruled over by a planetary governor, largely for the purpose of recruitment. The harsh living conditions here is ideal for producing hardy soldiers for the Guard or the Adeptus Astartes. Sometimes these primitive recruits are trained in massive groups in vast drill camps, whilst other times they're simply given a las gun and thrown into a war zone. Culture shock is, of course, an issue, and can even result in madness, but those that maintain their grip on sanity will often retain their primitive superstitions and tribal ways. Of course, distrust and aversion to witchcraft is always seen as a positive within the Imperium. Death worlds are similar in that they're harsh planets that produce capable soldiers, but these are worlds in which the native flora and fauna has evolved in such a way to be nearly inimical to human life. Humans can and do live on these worlds, but it's a never-ending struggle, with the population ranging from as few as 1,000 to as much as 15 million. Death worlds take many forms, from jungle-covered hellholes to barren volcanic wastelands, and most of them do not contain human settlements, but rather imperial outposts and support facilities. Some of these planets are rich in minerals, animals, vegetables, or gases, so tithes can get set up. But as mentioned, some of the hardiest soldiers in the Imperium come from death worlds, the most notable of which is Catacan, and its jungle fighters. It's been theorized that many death worlds are the result of biological seeding by ancient tyrannid hive fleets, as many of the monstrous creatures on these worlds have features in common with tyrannid organisms and may be descended from them. Similarly titled, but quite a bit different, are dead worlds, which are planets devoid of any ecosystem, atmosphere, or native life. These worlds generally aren't worth the massive terraforming process that would be required to make them habitable, but the Imperium and the Adeptus Mechanicus will occasionally use them to host research stations. These facilities are used to study planetary storm patterns, dissecting captured xenocorpses, charting the stability of warp entry locations, or probing the remains of ancient civilizations. Many of these worlds have always been dead, but some were reduced to that state through external events, such as a devastating war, a tyrannid incursion, or an exterminatus carried out by the Imperium. Necrons will often inhabit dead worlds, hibernating in ancient underground vaults, and if the Imperium becomes aware of this, the world will also gain the classification of a tomb world. Forge worlds are unique in that they are not governed by the branches of Adeptus Terra, but are solely controlled by the Adeptus Mechanicus. Forge worlds are completely covered in factories and industrial complexes, with mines burrowing deep into the planetary crust. The air is saturated with toxic gases, and rivers flow with toxic runoff from the multitude of manufactoria. And in many cases, even the seas and oceans of the world have been purposefully evaporated to make room for more manufactoria. Life here is harsh, even by Imperial standards, as every child born is tested extensively to best find their use and how might they serve the Mechanicus and the Omnissiah. The most promising might eventually join the priesthood of the cult Mechanicus. A percentage of the most physically able might become Skitarii warriors, but most are going to become part of the endless ranks of forge workers. These workers are free to make what lives they can for themselves in conditions similar to that of a hive world, as long as their work quotas are met and order is maintained. Forge worlds are responsible for the bulk of the weapons, munitions, spacecraft, vehicles, and, of course, the Titans, the giant walking war machines belonging to the Mechanicus. Every Forge world will make certain things in their own specific ways, called patterns, so that a tank from one Forge world will be characteristically different from another Forge world's. Forge worlds will also have a large number of shrines devoted to the Mechanicus deity, the Omnissiah, as they are just as much holy worlds to the Mechanicus as shrine worlds are to the rest of the Imperium. There also exist the somewhat similar industrial worlds, which are also planets wholly devoted to manufacturing and heavy mining, but these are controlled by the branches of Adeptus Terra rather than the Mechanicus. These comprise the main classifications for worlds belonging to the Imperium of Mankind, but there are plenty of lesser classifications that further indicate the definition and purpose of a world. There are, of course, the Adeptus Astartes homeworlds, home to a Space Marine fortress monastery, and ruled by the Chapter Master. These worlds are exempt from normal Imperial tithes, and are the base at which each Space Marine chapter trains and houses their Astartes, as well as recruit new aspirants in the case of many chapters. Some chapters are entirely fleet-based, with one of their ships acting as their fortress monastery, such as the Imperial Fists, so they possess no homeworld. The Ecclesiarchy of the Imperium handles two different types of planets, the Shrine Worlds and the Cardinal Worlds. A Cardinal World is any that is controlled by the Ecclesiarchy, and generally don't have any real religious significance beyond that. There might be a high concentration of priests there, or massive theological libraries, but otherwise it's meant to be a somewhat self-sufficient world ruled by a cardinal of the ecclesiarchy. Shrine worlds, on the other hand, while also ruled by the ecclesiarchy, are noted as such for being devoted to a saint of the Imperium, or are otherwise holy sites. These worlds are places of eternal rest for holy men and women of the Imperium, and the surfaces of these planets are covered in cathedrals, shrines, and hallowed crypts. They often attract huge amounts of pilgrims that come to pay honor and respect to the saints and other renowned individuals here, or otherwise step foot on a planet where a great miracle was said to occur. Most shrine worlds fall into another category, such as being an agra world, a hive world, or even a death world, but become a shrine world due to having a strong relationship with a saint or a miracle. War worlds are those that are classified as being a war zone, where a long-term conflict is ongoing, filled with immense armies of millions of troops, mercenaries, pirates, and reavers. These worlds have been devastated by orbital bombardment and artillery that has lasted for decades, and when or if these worlds ever cease conflict, there's a good chance that they'll end up as dead worlds. If not, the Imperium will eventually send colonists from overcrowded worlds, willingly or not, to repopulate the planet, but this process may take centuries for the bureaucracy to accomplish. Similarly, fortress worlds are those situated in key locations that serve as bastions of the Imperium's defense against a constant and persistent threat. These are extremely well defended, and their populations and economies are wholly geared towards meeting the demands of Imperial defense. The most famous of these was Cadia, located next to the Eye of Terror, but it was destroyed during the 13th Black Crusade. Paradise worlds, or pleasure worlds, are the rare planets that possess an outstanding natural beauty and atmosphere. These are used for the enjoyment of important imperial visitors, such as members of major noble houses, the novice nobilite, planetary governors, important ecclesiarchy officials, imperial commanders, rogue traders, and wealthy chartist captains. These are often very cultured places, with large portions of the population dedicated to producing works of art, music, or other forms of entertainment, and the worlds are filled with casino complexes, opulent restaurants, and huge ballrooms. The tithes here are either very low or non-existent, as many are only lightly populated, but life here is extremely tranquil, with some using it to quietly train or contemplate. That being said, they're not without problems, and pleasure worlds often host one or more chaos cults dedicated to Slanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, especially worlds that cater to the tastes of more depraved guests. Other imperial classifications for worlds include penal worlds, for housing human convicts in mass, cemetery worlds, for the burial of large amounts of honored dead, armory worlds that are used to store massive amounts of weapons, ammunition, and war machines while awaiting transportation, numbering in the millions of tons, and waste worlds, used entirely for the dumping and storage of unusable materials, chemical and biological wastes, and other useless and toxic manufacturing byproducts. There are also the classifications for worlds not currently in control by the Imperium, such as demon worlds, orc worlds, Tau worlds, and exodite worlds, protected by craft world Eldar in the hope that they will one day use them to regain their empire. As I mentioned, the scale of this setting is rather comical, and it's simply too hard to really fathom what it would mean to have an entire planet covered end to end in factories or farms. The scale of the setting is so that planets can easily get wiped out, with billions upon billions of lives lost, and it's a relatively minor event as far as humanity and the Imperium is concerned, since they'll just set up 10 more like it. This scale is obviously a very amusing part of Warhammer 40k, especially when considering that humans aren't even the most populous species in the galaxy, as that honor goes to the orcs, or perhaps the Tyranids. The life of a single person in this universe is infinitesimally insignificant, carrying out their entire life in one tiny section of one planet amongst a million, all in glorious service to the Imperium and the God Emperor.